So my background, as was just said, I was Chief Product Officer at Coursera. I was employee 50. When I left, we were about 300 people. It was a very great run at Coursera. I'm currently a partner at Venrock, looking to invest in early stage seed Series A companies. Prior to all of this, I was VP of product at Netflix. When I started at Netflix, we were a quaint DVD by mail company in the US only. When I left Netflix, we were global streaming and originals all over the world. Now it's even more of that. So that was a very, very interesting and great run there. My question to all of you to start this out, because we're talking about building a product and engineering relationship that works, and I'd like to see a show of hands. How many actually think you need a product team, or you can just suffice with an engineering team? Like, why do you need PMs? That will also be my last question for the panelists, but how many think it's really important to have a product team to help shepherd the engineering team? Show of hands. Okay, brave souls. Who out there thinks you can ditch, there's not a lot of PMs here anyway, I saw the demographics, so you're not gonna offend them. Who thinks you could ditch the PMs and just get away with having engineers only? Okay, we got one. Oh, we got two. All right, we got two. We're gonna have 2 or 3 people. That's great. So we'll see what our panelists think. That's the topic of this conversation. We'll try to convince or either the 3 or 2 of you that you definitely need product, or the majority that you don't. So now I'd like to welcome up the panelists. I don't think I need a mic. Okay, there we go. So as they're coming up, let me introduce them. First here is Varun Srinivasan. Varun is Director of Engineering at Coinbase. He's an ex-founder and was a program manager at Microsoft. Next up, we have Seth Sakomoto. He's the VP of Engineering and interim head of product at Envoy, ex-VP of Engineering, TuneIn, Hipmunk, Reardon Commerce. He was Director of Engineering at Intuit and others. Next is Madhura Dudhgaonkar. She's the head of ML engineering at Workday, is ex-engineering leader at Sun and Adobe. And then last but not least is Brian Zotter. Brian is the head of product engineering at Medium. He was ex-VP of engineering at Salesforce, and he's a 2-time founder. So round of applause for the panelists. Okay, so my first question for the 4 of you is, since the topic is building a product and engineering relationship that works, what does a good working relationship look like between product and engineering? I'll give my take on this, and I'd like to hear, maybe we'll go down the line for this one and hear how you guys think about this. So my answer to what does a good product and engineering relationship look like would be building what customers want / getting business results on time and with happy teams. We're going for controversy, so please give counter positions to that.
All right. So I'm going to have to agree with those 3 things to start off with, but the thing that I'll say is the most important about the relationship is having clarity on roles and responsibilities. Like the best PMs I've worked with, like we go into weekly stand-ups, we go into meetings, and we know exactly what each of us is bringing to the table. And we have a unified vision of what we want to communicate to the team, what we want to do next, and how that's going to get us towards our vision.
That's great.
I'll say it's plus 1 and 2. Which is not controversial, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay, we'll get there.
But I think it's also a team that challenges each other, that collectively comes up with the best problems to solve and the best solutions to solve them, regardless of who's on the team and who's coming up with which idea. So I'd say a good team, a good working relationship is one of high trust. There are different backgrounds, different levels of experience, different insights, certainly different jobs, but they're able to harness all that to come up with the best problems and best solutions.
Great, thank you.
I would say the 2 things that make it work is boundaries plus flexibility. Having clarity on roles and responsibilities, but not being stuck on those boundaries where, when needed, filling each other's gap. So being flexible enough where you're not too hell-bent about it, but you're working towards a common vision as a team and shifting as necessary. But those 2 things together, I've seen, makes it work the best.
Okay. Brian, you get to go last.
Damn, I can't disagree with any of that.
All right.
But for me, trust is number 1, what Seth said. Once you have that trust in the relationship, then you know clearly like who's doing what, roles and responsibilities. So the teams are working well together, and then they're shipping, and shipping is what makes teams happy. Like that was one of yours. I think really shipping is the thing that makes things happy, the teams happy.
Okay, that makes sense. Most of the questions here, just I'll give you a little hint of how we did this, we talked about ahead of time. I'm going to give them one that we didn't. So I'm actually curious. We talked about what it looks like. How do you know it's working? And maybe I'll start with you, Brian. Like, what are the characteristics of a product and eng team that you see that shows you that it's working?
Yeah, it is the shipping.
Shipping.
Shipping is the number one metric, I think, for a team, because all the other things are in place. They're working well together. The roles are clearly defined. People in the team know what they're doing, and it's getting the velocity they need to ship. Like I said, people are very happy. Engineers are very happy. Product teams are very happy when they're shipping.
Okay. Anyone else have other thought on that?
Yeah, so I think when it's not working, some of the things you'll start to see are people not being motivated.
Yeah.
Engineers don't know why they're working on this thing that they're working on. Product managers think engineers spend too much time on things that don't matter. Like those are kind of the dysfunctions that start to happen when that relationship breaks down.
So let me key on the shipping for a second. What if you're just shipping all the time, but it actually isn't things that matter? You know, isn't that a possibility that you're on time, the code's great, you know, you're actually producing a lot of things, but it doesn't matter?
Shipping value is the piece for the end user, and which is where the product piece is very important. They own the who is your end user. They own the what is it, that MVP, that hypothesis that you're going to test fast and ship it. And the when piece is important too, go to market. So if product is thinking about that appropriately and engineering is giving input on the when piece, how long it's going to take, right? Whatever MVP they came up with, and also how are they going to ship it? Then you probably ship value. And the other thing I'm going to add to what Varun was saying, if I ask team members on both sides, hey, do you look forward to coming in to work? Right? A simple question. Do you look forward Sunday night to go in there and solve whatever problem you're trying to solve? Doesn't matter what the scope might be. And if the answer starts becoming maybe, no, then you dig in deeper, because the engagement piece is equally important to shipping value.
Yeah.
I'm going to add, you mentioned testing, I think shipping and learning. Because I'm going to already volunteer my end question and answer is, I do believe product is super important because we're not that smart. We think we might have a hypothesis that...
Who's we?
Collectively.
Just
about what customers need or want.
All of us.
All of us. Okay.
We almost never hit it the first time. We almost never completely solve the problem, unless it's a very incremental change to something that already exists. Most times, if you're building a product, from scratch or it's a wider open area, you can't hope to think that you understand everything about all of your potential customers, new customers. Your ability to not only ship quickly, which is absolutely key to learning anything, but also being able to adapt that together. What I see with a lot of not so functional organizations is there's this sort of opinion-driven or sort of perceived smartness where there's a lot of debates, a lot of internal discussion about what customers need, and that just takes a long time and it impacts shipping. And then when it finally comes out, like you would expect, the mark wasn't hit. But on top of that, the team's frustrated because they spent 2 months figuring that out.
So instead, just ship quickly, learn from what you're doing, implement that, and the next time you ship, keep that cycle going.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have a hypothesis before you ship.
Sure.
Because you are confirmation bias. If you don't first think about, okay, what is the hypothesis? What is the needle I'm going to move with this particular change that's going on? You won't know whether it happened or not, and a good way to test it.
So I love hypotheses. What is a good hypothesis?
You should be able to.
Yep.
A good hypothesis is what you have a clear sense of how you can measure whether whatever hypothesis you're trying to validate or not. It should be black and white. Whether once you ship, whatever that action that you want your end users to take or whoever your customers are, is there signal did your signal increase? And unless you have a sense of what is that hypothesis, that my traction is going to grow, whatever, my chart is like this right now, it's going to start doing this. Right? You have to have something that you can look at and go, oh, that didn't really happen. And then you go to your next hypothesis. Okay, let's try something else.
Any other thoughts? Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, we pretty much run our engineering with the hypothesis mindset, and we're running about a dozen hypotheses all the time at Medium. And just give you an example, like we think conversion will increase if we change our ranking algorithm like X, and then we'll deploy that hypothesis or that test to 10% of our audience, watch it over a couple of days. If it performs, then we roll it out. Right? So it's always that constant feedback loop that's driving. So it's like very data driven.
And do you have to, how important is it to state by how much you think it's going to increase?
Oh, it's very important.
Yeah.
Because that is part of the impact of the equation of prioritization. There's cost and there's impact.
Right.
And you want the highest impact at the lowest cost at the top of the backlog.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so the next question I'll direct towards Seth and Madhura to start, and then everyone can add in. I'm kind of curious, so we've talked a little bit about what it looks like when you've got a good working relationship. How do you bring these teams together? How do you bring product and engineering together to actually accomplish something?
You want to go? Okay.
Madhura, why don't you start? Yeah.
I'll use the process I use, and I'm sure there's different ways to do this. You involve everybody that is going to help you achieve your goal in co-creating a vision. I'm a big believer in, contrary to some of the popular belief, a leader has a vision and you delegate it to somebody else to execute. My operational model is, I have a sense of what I want to achieve, but I want to bring my team together where maybe they have a better idea about some aspects of the vision that I started with. So co-creating, shaping, and tweaking it together collectively, the kind of ownership I've seen after doing that, even if it takes us some hours, because we're all smart. We all have opinions that are valid, creative. It's not just one person that can bring out the best vision forward. So every time I take on a new team, every time I take on anything new, whoever the leadership is at least, and when I say leadership, it's all the functional leaders, it's also the senior technical leaders, so my staff engineers and principals, whoever you think is going to have an opinion about this and might add value to that final vision. And after that, you let them loose. And they own it like there is no tomorrow because they've created it with you. But that has always worked for me without fear.
Okay, that's great. Seth?
Yeah, I would add to that. I think vision and common goals, because the vision isn't always the same thing as certain goals, like also ensuring that the product has good quality. That may not be manifested in the vision, but it's really important that the more common goals you have, the more chance you have to, of course, be on the same page. Because they're shooting. So outlining those goals and agreeing on those, whether it's keeping the productivity of the engineering team fast while not adding bugs, while achieving the vision. It's all of that series of and statements that you want to make to be on the same page. And I think the second thing is just building trust, which sounds fluffy, but I think you can do specific tactics to ensure that there is a sort of a peer relationship within the team as opposed to some sort of perceived or even invisible hierarchy. For instance, one thing that we do at Envoy is this process called an inception, which is effectively a brainstorm. And the rules of engagement are the problem gets brought to the team, the hypothesis, problem, but no solutions. And it's up to the team to collectively come up with defining the solution. May come from the product manager because they've been spending some time thinking about it, may come from a designer, an engineer, but the idea is it starts leveling the playing field of we're all in it together, trying to solve the same problem. So far, it's been effective for us. Doesn't always work, but that's one of the techniques for kind of making sure that the team feels like they're all in it together.
Yep, that's great. So Madhura, and I'd actually welcome everyone to comment on this. Co-creation, that makes a lot of sense, because if you get everyone involved, hypothetically you get the best ideas, and then people own those ideas more than just a top-down direction. Now, on the other side of this, it can get messy because
Yes,
there's lots of
does.
different opinions, and it might not be the most efficient. And maybe it gets watered down because in order to get it over the finish line, you took a little 10% of Brian and 10% of Seth, and Varun got 15%, and you have this Frankenstein vision that just sort of has no purity.
I'm glad you said it because it is messy. It's a harder way to do it, but the capability as a leader you need to master for this to work is facilitation. Facilitating hard conversation is one of the most important skills a leader can have because you do want to hire really smart, high-performing people. And how do you get the creative juices flowing, and how do you navigate them to a place where it doesn't become a consensus-driven decision?
Mm-hmm.
It is not a consensus-driven decision. So I go in with the conversation going. I'll bring the final pieces together. Why don't we all brainstorm together? And you do have to help them get to a place where it feels cohesive, complete, and generally because it's a well-facilitated discussion, it doesn't fall into that.
Okay. Any, Brian or Varun, do you guys?
The art of choosing when to switch from consensus to, okay, now we're going to make a decision is something that I've gotten better at over the years because you want to make sure everyone's voice is heard. You want to hear all the different inputs, but then there needs to be a time when, okay, we need to make progress. And probably early in my career, maybe that went on a little too long. But now it's a point where everyone feels like they're in it, even though it might not be their exact idea, but they've contributed, and this will make them much more committed.
But what if you work with a founder who invented blogging, for instance, and maybe has a very specific vision of what should happen, and you're someone who wants to do the co-creation thing, and that person hypothetically is like, no, this is what we're doing.
Yeah. A founder like that is, he's actually very receptive to this idea of bringing people along, and he understands that he doesn't have all the answers. He has a lot of them, but he does appreciate, and this is over time as well, that if he does go through this process, he sees one, it's a better thing at the end because it's input, and people are more bought in to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think input is a really good way to think about it rather than co-creating. Co-creating gives a solution that everybody gets to be part of decision making. And I actually think it's important to have a clear decision maker. This person's going to be the one that decides whether it's the engineering leader, whether it's the product leader, whether it's an engineer on the team. It's actually really important to know who makes the final call, but make everyone feel heard in that process.
Okay, that makes sense.
I would just agree, and I think the ultimate fallback is testing and validation after this is why freaking shipping, because customers don't lie, the data doesn't lie. Ultimately, that's going to be the real tiebreaker. It may be a more expensive way to find out that, the camel you made after trying to design a horse wasn't quite right, but at the very least, you will be able to learn. It's kind of a fallback.
Okay. So maybe, Varun, we can start with you on this next question. I'm curious, can you talked about this a little bit earlier. Can you give examples of when you've seen product and engineering relationship break down? What happened?
Yeah.
What were some of the causes of that? What did you do to resolve it?
So I think most of the time when these relationships break down, it's rarely because the people aren't competent or because they don't like each other. It's often because there isn't clarity on those roles and responsibilities. And you see all the dysfunctions I talked about earlier. Lack of motivation, people not knowing why they're working on a certain thing. I think the best way to resolve it is you need to make sure that the team has channels of communication so that they're able to share positive and negative feedback with each other. And if you have this, you can start building expectations on top of it. You're responsible for doing this, you're responsible for doing this, and together we're going to go here. And if people are able to deliver on that, you can start moving back towards a high-functioning team.
So, that sounds so simple. Why doesn't that happen?
Because that first piece is actually really hard. Getting people to communicate and talk about what's working and what's not working is actually really, really difficult. And there's a lot of different techniques in how you can think about this. But that's actually something we're, as people, just not intrinsically very good at or very motivated to do on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, every organization is different.
Yeah.
And I like the way you say about clarifying the roles and responsibilities. Every organization I worked at had different responsibilities for those positions. And what we did, because we were having to struggle as well, is we wrote out role definitions for the product owner, the team lead, and the engineering manager. And it's like this couple page doc where it's like, this is what you're accountable for, and this is what you're responsible for. We're using like the RACI model, if you guys know that.
Yeah.
And that helped tremendously.
What was the model you said?
RACI?
RACI? Can you
Or
explain that
RASCI.
really? Yeah.
RACI or ASCII.
Yeah.
Both, either one works.
Okay.
And then it was like this living document that we can point to and be like, here, this is how the team is operating. Here are your responsibilities. And it was very clear who was doing what. And that leads to better communication because now we know, well, who is responsible for communicating the status in our sprint review. Okay, great.
That's great.
I think outside the team, you need some sort of validation too, not just in the eyes of customers, but usually there's a check and balance, perhaps a set of stakeholders or something that are asking, it's great you're working together, are you still tracking to the goals? Because I've actually seen a different dysfunction sometimes where the team trusts each other and likes each other so much, but yet they're still demotivated because they're just deferring to each other. Like, well, you spent a whole lot of time on that wireframe, so it must be right. So let's just build it. I don't know why we're doing it that way and what problem we're solving, but you seemed like you spent a lot of time on this. So, also ensuring that the team is not only trusting, but also using that trust and the line of communication to then challenge and really maximize the inputs and even tease out some inputs that maybe aren't coming out. Like, why the heck are we doing this? These are great inputs to facilitate. Sometimes that's hard when a team spends every waking moment together. Maybe they don't want to step on toes or anything. So sometimes an external kind of check and balance can help. Saying, hey guys, I know you like each other, but why are you shipping that?
And how do you, so you're kind of touching on this a little bit.
Yeah.
How do you, as a leader of engineering, know when things are going off the rails in the teams? Like, what are the early indicators of that?
Well, I think there are several. I think there are the signs of dysfunction, which are just a matter of, I think, keeping a pulse on the folks that are within the team, talking to them. There's certainly the ability to validate hypotheses, hit goals, have goals that sound like goals as opposed to solutions. That's one of, I guess, the biggest signs for me whenever a team is already in the wrong direction, when their project scope sounds awfully like a solution. Like, build this widget to do something. Like, what's the problem? And so these are some of the techniques, I guess, I use. A lot of it's just kind of talking, but also understanding the context enough to poke in.
When you create an environment where spotting problems and speaking up is encouraged, you hear it because you've asked for it. So the signals come up if you allow the signals to come up. I do want to say, though, you're not shooting for harmony. That's the worst thing you can do between product and engineering. There will be some friction between really good product and eng teams. There will be. If there is no friction, I start worrying. So there is a judgment, like Brian was saying, finding the balance between, are they asking each other questions where it's not too much deferring to, oh, I trust you, so you must have thought through what business value this is coming through, but there should be a healthy amount of question to get details on both sides, where nobody's taking it the wrong way, where as a product, if I ask Seth, hey, why the hell are you taking 3 months to build this whatever technical thing I don't understand? It's dealing my go-to-market. And Seth shouldn't get defensive about it, but he should explain it to help the product manager understand the impact. So just because you don't understand each other speak doesn't mean there shouldn't be dialogue. So asking questions to each other, I actually encourage it and ask that happens. And some friction might arise out of it, but you just help people build the capability to still have that trust in spite of friction.
So can anyone share some of the bigger mistakes you've made in trying to build these product and engineering relationships that work?
I can talk about one.
Okay. Safe place. We've got psychological safety here. You can.
More worried we don't have enough time.
Yeah, there's no one listening. It's just us.
Yeah.
Tissue
So,
box.
so some friction was happening on one of the Scrum teams across our org, and I was hearing from the PM, I was hearing from the engineering manager, I was hearing from the product director and the engineering director. Everybody's just going, they're not doing their job. And like Brian said, we went through this whole exercise of doing RACI, RASCI, because I realized they're just stepping on each other's toes and they don't have clarity on, oh, who should be doing what. So we went through that exercise, and I thought problem solved, right? You would think. And the friction didn't die in spite of that. And that's where I'm like, okay, my hypothesis was wrong. And once I observed them enough, I realized there was trust issues. It had nothing to do with roles and responsibilities between the senior leaders. And then at that point, I switched what we did, which was 3 of us kind of talked about it. I talked to them individually and then said, guys, this is not going to work if 3 of us are not aligned. There is no way this is going to work if you guys don't trust each other. And we can't blame our team because we are not setting them up for success. Then, and that also took some time where we had to work through that for a couple of months before those 2 leaders. They're both smart, and which is why there was friction. But over time, we got to a place where now they respect each other, they trust each other, and none of them gets defensive when one person asks the other a question. And they don't take it the wrong way, but it took time.
I've seen that blow up too, where it isn't the roles and responsibilities, it's actually the trust between 2 people.
2 individuals, yeah.
Okay, let's get in the room and let's resolve this, and it just turns into finger pointing and heats and elevates and to the point where you're like, whoa, shouldn't have done that. So is there a good way to approach that, or is that just inevitable that sometimes the relationship's just not going to work?
Yeah, it can be messy.
I was gonna say, you said don't do that, or that's a bad idea. I think you need to do that as soon as possible,
at some point,
because
to force the issue?
To force the issue, because these things kind of fester, and then they'll blow up at the wrong time. But by forcing the issue, you get to either way, this is not going to work, and then we should just part ways, different teams maybe, or we can finally start making healthy progress.
And if you're a good facilitator, again, that skill is so important for everything you do with your team. And you do have to get them in a room and pull out concerns from both sides, help them see the positive sides for both those individuals so that they realize, oh, wait a minute, both of us have the same goal, which is to help our team succeed. And then it starts moving towards the right direction. But you do have to deal with the uncomfortableness of working through it.
That's great. I think there's probably a lot more we could talk about on that one, but I'm going to keep us moving. There's a bunch of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to mix some of those in right now. Top voted one right here. What documents, decks, etc., are used to communicate roles and responsibilities?
Documents, decks. RACI or RASCI, if you Google it.
What does that stand for? Do you know?
It's what is it? Responsible, accountable,
Consulting,
informed.
There you go. Okay.
So you can just follow that template and put it in a Google Doc, wherever, doesn't matter. But it's a good way to get them to talk to each other about boundaries. Any framework works. Frameworks, it's just one of the tools. You might find something else. But the conversation is the important piece, not the tool itself.
I'd say job descriptions. I mean, it's the expectations you have of the roles. For a product, I think facilitator is absolutely part of the, at least one of the core skills or attributes or behaviors that are being a good one for both getting the best out of the team, for identifying these trouble spots, and if that's not built into the upfront expectations of who you hire and what you value for the individuals, you're more likely to not get that. So, and likewise with engineers, you would expect not only is their expectation to code, but also to ensure that they understand why they're doing something. If they don't, that's a flag, and it's their job to also raise the flag. So, It starts with individual expectations then before you get to team level.
So can I ask for someone to do like a brief, what does a product manager do and what does an engineer do?
So I think good product managers are responsible for strategy. They think about like, what does the customer want? How are we going to get there? And what are we going to do tomorrow to realize that vision? Engineering leaders are often responsible for their teams, happiness of their people, getting people into their teams when they need to grow, and resource allocation. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that falls in the middle, like roadmaps, which is about priorities, but also about resource allocation. And that's where a lot of the friction comes into play, is figuring out who on your team is going to be the owner for that. And I think that comes down to a conversation. Some organizations have norms, but it's always best to just talk it out and say, hey, I'm going to own this because X, Y, and Z, and I think I'm going to be the best person to make these decisions.
And not be rigid on it. Some project to project, it might change a little bit.
Exactly. And to also playing to the strengths of the people.
Does anyone have any additions to the sort of definition of a product manager or an engineer that they'd like to throw out?
Might add, maybe this is just me, but or my local view, but it's to collect and synthesize the variety of inputs, primarily customer and business inputs, to be coherent. There are so many ways we hear from customers as well as our internal stakeholders about what's important. Being able to take that and boil it down to something that people could get their head around, I think it's a big core part there. And the bigger the company you get, the more inputs you have, so the more critical that role gets.
If I had to say it in a tweet, it would be product, what and why, engineering, how.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
Twitter format for everything.
Who, what, why. Yeah.
Do PMs need to be technical?
Depends.
Show of hands. Who thinks yes?
What if
Audience.
you're-
Who
Yeah.
thinks
It
yes in the
depends.
audience? PMs need to be technical? Okay.
I would qualify that with gradients of technical.
All right.
Like writing code every day, no. Knowing what a computer does, that's definitely helpful. I think and there's a range, and it sort of
There's a
depends on
range,
what they're working on.
And depending on which layer of the stack
Yeah.
you're trying to PM, that you need to be a little bit more technology savvy is how I would say it, not technical. And if you're in the infrastructure layers, data platform, and if you do have a PM in those teams, then they probably need to understand what the hell is this thing versus the end user you
Yep.
might get away without.
That makes sense. So Seth, you're like, PMs need to be technical enough to know what a computer is. Brian, where's your bar for technical ability?
I raise my hand because, again, like they want to understand enough where they can triage things coming in, and so they know like, oh, this is going to be a really big problem or not. They can do some slight prioritization, but I actually think it's healthy if they are not super technical, because one, they'll try to get into the how, and that's always a conflict between product and engineering teams as a product manager, like making suggestions on how we should do this. Also, it limits the thinking if they are technical. And sometimes it's nice having a non-technical PM just be like, well, why don't we do this?
Why can't we do this?
Why can't we just like...
They push the boundaries because they don't know. So I'm on Brian's side. If there was a choice between a technical person for the end user facing product layer, I would go with the non-technical person because I need them to push boundaries. We know too much as engineers,
Right.
and we hold ourselves back.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add that, one of my favorite interview questions for PMs who join is, when have you had to change your roadmap based on engineering constraints? And I think that cuts to the core of the issue is, can you understand technical constraints enough to know when you need to shift your strategy on what to deliver?
So to that question, how much time in a roadmap should be spent on tech, debt, refactoring, innovation, switching platforms, this type of thing? And who decides?
That's a great question. Technical debt, you fundamentally need a framework for how to think about it. I think it's one of those things that's really hard for non-engineers to understand. It's hard to see, it's hard to measure, and it's often hard for someone who's not an engineer to know if you're thinking about the right things or if scope creep is going on. So I think one of the things I've done at Coinbase, for example, PMs know that so at Coinbase, trust and safety is super important to us. So PMs know that when there's debt that complicates trust and safety, I'm going to prioritize it super high. They also know that when it's other things where product velocity is important, I'm willing to compromise and accrue some debt. So I think the best piece of advice I have is if you're working with a product leader who's skeptical about technical debt, try to create a framework for here's when I will not accrue debt. Here's when I will actually try to pay it down. And here's when I'm willing to take some on in order to reach some goals for the company. And I think if you're able to do that, you can build that trust and you can start making those decisions about what to put on the roadmap.
Seth?
Yeah, I agree. And I'll build on that. I'm super cautious about setting sort of one-size-fits-all guidelines and rules around that, because it depends. If it's a V1 of a brand spanking new product, is it appropriate to invest in the future of that?
Yep.
When you don't even know if the first one's going to work? Probably not. Now, you don't want to ask engineers to not be as good of engineers as they normally are good engineers, but there are ways to proportionalize that.
Right.
Likewise, if you're working on a V20 of a hardened core product that's the core of the business, you may make different decisions. I think it's around aligning those goals. Because too often I see those become used as weapons against each other. Like, well, hey, I've got my tech debt carve out, so you can't touch that. As opposed to getting deeper into the why. What are the projects you're trying to do? What are the problems we're trying to solve within that investment? So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Phase depends on the phase of your product. In the early phases, when you're still trying to go from 0 to 1 from product perspective, you want to accrue tech debt. And once you've gotten to a place where you have customers, you know this needs to now scale and be stable and all that, at that point is when you start figuring out, okay, what percentage now I want to start saving to not let this accrue more, and then over time, that percentage will shift. The other factor is developer productivity, I guess, because that's the invisible stuff that the product people don't see. And if there's a really great cartoon, if you Google "too busy to work," there is these people that are taking stuff on a cart, and there's a guy standing there with a wheel saying, "Hey, you should probably use this," and they're like, "No, we're too busy." I've used that picture with product managers. I'm like, this is what you're saying when you say no to this particular item. It's I can give you more shipping speed if you let us deal with it. Even if you don't understand what this is, this is the impact if we don't do this.
Okay. All right, question from the audience, Brian. How do you square an Eng team that wants to work quickly in an agile manner and a product team that wants quarterly commits, deliverables in a waterfall paradigm?
What was the first? How do you
square an Eng team that wants to work quickly in an agile manner and a product team that wants to have rigid commits, deliverables in a waterfall system?
Yeah. Having long-term quarterly goals is great, but giving that to a team, it needs to be broken up to have milestones along the way so we know if we're going in the right directions. So I would try to make product understand that, hey, engineering, we want to make progress, we want to ship, and we want to learn as fast as possible to make sure it is going in the right way and we are seeing our metrics move in the right way. We're still going to be focused on the North Star, which is our quarterly goal, but these incremental agile sprints are going to allow us to, one, make sure we're getting there, and then change based on if it doesn't look like we're going to hit it or not. So once product understands that and they see it, then they get it. And they love that they can change things. When you're doing true agile, they love that they can change things every sprint.
Let's see, Varun. What role do product leaders have in shaping the org structure of the engineering team?
So again, I think it comes back to that input decision framework. I think product managers have great insight into how to align teams around missions. But I think ultimately the engineering leaders get to make the decision because they understand their people, the intrinsic nature of engineering, and all of these constraints better. So that's how we do things at Coinbase. PMs provide great input into structuring teams, and EMs make the final call on who goes where.
Okay. Any other?
Nothing to add. That was
Okay.
Agreed.
Madhura, do you think an ML team needs a PM?
If you haven't done ML at your company yet, definitely.
Why?
ML right now, there is so much still hype and just within the engineers, let's say, right? Forget product. And they want to use all these new toys that are coming up. And if you don't have a PM, they're going to go to town with deep learning, even if a simple heuristics can solve that end user's problem without even going to the complex. So we have to keep an eye on that. Okay, let's not get too shiny here. If there is a faster way for you and a simpler way for you to build this product with a simple method that has nothing to do with deep learning or anything that's going on that's newer in the ML frenzy. So I would say you definitely need a PM, especially for ML, because it's the least understood thing. Even within engineering teams, I have that conversation, the product teams that we serve as an ML platform team. They are talking about, oh, I want to use deep learning. I'm like, no, what problem are you trying to solve? Let's start there, because you might not even need me. You might be able to solve it with something simple.
That's great. Seth, how do you recommend structuring project or engineering orgs to help ensure there's a good relationship between both areas? Should they sit together? Should they not sit together? How do they set goals together? Like maybe all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all techniques to physical proximity. You tend to like and talk to people that are closer to you because we're lazy. So the less you have to walk, the better. So definitely from a seating perspective. I think having common goals, it goes back to the common goals. And if your goals make sense and are durable, that provides you at least sort of the groundwork to have a durable investment, which looks like a team, looks like a set of people that are going to spend lots of time getting their head deep into the problem and lots of time allocated to keep cycling on that problem until they get it right. So it starts with, I guess, goals and in durable problems, both customer or business. If you think that's going to happen for some period of time, that's, I think, the groundwork for a type of product organization. And with that, then you can organize around that. You can have a product person who's, responsible for that problem domain. You can have an engineering leader, tech lead, set of engineers that are also responsible for that problem domain. So that's how I think of it. It's the starting material for org structure. I think beyond that, it definitely goes into what Varun said, which is you still have to, put the right people together that you feel best serves the needs. There may be other kind of also constraints company-wide, like there's a whole lot of tech debt in our mobile apps. We happen to have 7 code bases for 4 products, don't ask. So right now, our bias is to have a mobile team because there's Conway's Law and all these other kind of, it creates team biases to solve that, and it's important for us to solve that. So sometimes that also factors in, but you should start with what the problems are we're trying to solve.
Okay.
And are those durable?
That's great. Rob, what do you do if an engineer on your team comes to you and says, hey, I've got an engineering manager who all they keep asking me about is the engineering OKRs, maybe about innovation on the technology, or have you retired all these bugs, or whatever. And I've got a product manager who keeps asking me about these new features that they want built. I can't do both these things. Who do I listen to?
That's actually pretty good. That means there's a good conflict between product getting what they need for value and engineers getting enough time to do technical debt stuff. You use the word friction. I use the word conflict. It seems to be like a dirty word, but I actually think it's very healthy. And I do want to hear from both sides that I'm not getting enough product shipped or I'm not being able to get enough technical debt. And I would actually say that to folks like, this is great. It probably means we're in some sort of balance. Let's go and dig further to make sure it's the right balance. But I think it's healthy.
What if they're just unhappy? You're saying, hey, great, it's awesome. You're unhappy. That's perfect.
Yeah. Well, so we continue to ship, and they might not be unhappy. They're probably unhappy because they don't understand the value of what that shipping product will actually do to the business. And so then I would dig into okay, is product doing its job of explaining the value? And are you actually making the right case for why this engineering work needs to be done? Because just like product needs to justify the why of product shipping stuff, Engineers need to justify the technical debt justification as well. Right? And so there's probably something not going there, and there's a communication breakdown.
So I'll add one more thing, which is like, I think while that tension is healthy, the dysfunction that's happening there is this engineer doesn't know who decides. Right. And so that's where the root of the problem is. It's fine to have good tension, but the engineer needs to know this is an X and Y decision, and the EM gets to make it, or the PM gets to make it, and they get finality on that. And I think that will create happiness and like clarity in the org.
There could also be a little bit of a process tool or decision-making problem along with that. You know, maybe those are all valid requests. Maybe the team's aligned, but somehow those requests combined add up to 200% of a person, and that person saying, I have to sleep. And so it could be, you know, sometimes it's the visibility of it, you know, getting it in the same team board or whatever, because I've seen that happen a lot in terms of dysfunction, which is, you know, a board might represent product things, but not engineering things. And as a result, the individual engineer is on the hook to do all these things, but some of it's not visible. As a result, the decisions are being made at the right level.
So closing us out, 20-second rapid fire on the question I started with, where we had 3 people in the audience who said, no, you don't need product organization. So let's say your company is at least 50 people. Do you need a PM? Yes or no? Each of you will answer. Let's start with you, Varun. And your quick 10-second justification as to why you said yes or no.
Yes. The reason for that is like 50 is that size when decision-making velocity starts to slow down. And you need a product manager who will push for decisions and clarity and who will outline the roadmap of exactly what you need to do.
Okay, Seth.
Yes, as long as they're great ones. As long as you have customers in business and you don't want your engineers spending all their time analyzing your customers or business, you absolutely do it.
Okay. Madhura.
You need it from day one. 50 is too early. In the beginning, your CEO is playing that role. But at the minute work becomes too much to handle between the 3-4 people, all you're doing is saying, okay, I don't seem to have enough time to be in that product mindset anymore. I need someone dedicated to own it, who's representing our customer and breathing and living as if it's an end user amongst you. So I would say 1 is when you start.
Okay.
Somebody else might be playing the role, but.
Great. Rob, last words.
Maybe.
All right.
But
I
you
didn't
do
give you that option. It was yes or no.
Yeah, I know. You do need a product owner, though, for every team. And I say that's different than product manager because that's someone who you hire for that specific job. But you need a product owner who's owning the backlog, who's accountable for the product.
Great. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom and insights. Let's give them a big round of applause.